Hello everyone, I'm created by Lottie and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm a full-time stained glass artist based here in the UK, and as a personal challenge I'm going to attempt to make all 151 Generation 1 Pokémon out of stained glass. And while yes, these tutorials are primarily going to be about making Pokémon out of stained glass, my goal is to make the tutorials as universal as possible so you can apply them to your own projects that you're working on. So I've already completed Bulbasaur, and next on my list is Ivysaur, and I've based this design on the original 151 Pokémon card. I used a circle design for this as well, which I don't tend to do because I find them a little trickier than the normal designs, but we will come on to that. But before we dive right into it, if you enjoy watching my YouTube videos, please will you like and subscribe because it really helps support my channel and help it grow. So here is my beautiful Ivysaur template that I'm going to be making. For the glass, I'm mixing 2 tones of pink for the flower. I've also got my favourite clear iridescent glass, and I'm trying to use up some of my scrap glass because I seem to be amassing a lot of it at the moment. I have the same turquoise blue opaque glass that I used for Bulbasaur, some more scraps of white glass for the eyes, and this beautiful 2-toned green glass for the leaves. However, with the green glass, the difference between the tones was so subtle and my studio can get a bit dark sometimes, so I've accidentally stuck them down on the wrong templates, but luckily I'd only just done it so the glue hadn't set yet, because when the glue has set, it's a nightmare and I just have to reprint them off and start all over again. But that means I get to play another game of Tetris template while I try and stick them all back down into place again. On my workbench, I keep a tub for all my glass shards that are just too tiny to work with again. My hopes is one day I could use these as like a mosaic piece, but I haven't got around to that yet. One day. I have my favourite glass cutter. It's not my favourite just because it's pink, but that does add to it. And my new favourite pliers that I actually got out of the Christmas advent calendar from Creative Glass Guild. They're just like really precise and I like them a lot. And my trusty Schilber Schnitt pliers that I can never pronounce, but you know what I'm getting at. And finally, my running pliers. I always start with the hardest cut first, which is usually an inward curve. The glass has more support when you're cutting the curve because you haven't cut it out of anything else yet, and that means it's less likely to cause an unwanted crack. I then cut with my pliers along the curve, and I actually listen out for the glass to crack. I'll be quiet now so you can actually hear it. And if it's an especially tricky section, I try to remove it in smaller pieces at a time. If you try to rush a cut without taking your time, which I've done many times before, it's likely just not going to go the way you want it to. And sometimes, depending on the glass, you can actually see from underneath how your crack's going, so you know which sections need more work and which ones are ready to break free. And once the hard part's done, it's just the easy bit of removing away the excess glass. This clear opaque glass is one of the easiest to cut with, which is why I always tend to use it for my background glass. It's iridescent, so it makes my piece shine, but it's also easy to work with. I really didn't think I was going to manage to cut this pink glass because it was just such an awkward angle. And I was almost certain it was going to like chop off the point there. But I was pleasantly surprised when it broke away clean. And now for my favourite part, which is the painting. You may have noticed I missed a very crucial step, and that's the grinding. For some reason, I didn't film the process for this project, but I do have a couple other videos that cover how I do it. I'm a huge fan of Pebeo 160 glass paint. It's my favourite one to work with, and for this piece I use brilliant turquoise, red and black. I still use my light box even though it only makes a small difference on opaque glass, but that small difference is still a difference, so it's worth using. And this is a bit through trial and error. I actually ignore the Pebeo paint instructions. So they say that you should paint it on thin and paint multiple layers, whereas I find that you see all sort of like messy brush strokes when I do that. So I prefer just to put a giant glob of paint on there and let it self-level and dry, but you need to make sure you leave it to dry longer than they recommend to say. They say 24 hours. I usually leave it for 2 days just to be safe. And again, I also ignore their recommendations on their baking time. I can't remember what they say exactly on the bottle, but I always bake it on the lowest shelf in my oven for 35 minutes on 160 degrees Celsius. I do it this way because I learned through trial and error. I found that when I had set it to their temperatures, it was burning some of the white glass and giving it like a yellowy tint on the top. And this is what works in my oven. Your oven may be different, so you just need to experiment with it a bit. Sometimes I have to get a bit creative with my light box because, like I said, on opaque glass I can't really see what I'm doing. So I cover what I'm painting with my hand to hide any extra light coming through, and then I can see it a bit clearer. And I do like a dot to dot on the glass piece, and then I simply just join the dots up. Now onto the copper foiling. I use Edco 3/16 black back copper foiled. This is the only brand of copper foil I've ever used, so I can't really comment on the variations of different brands, but I've heard other people say that their foil can peel off sometimes, and I've never had that issue with this brand, so I think if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and I'm just going to stick with it. I also tend to use a thinner copper foil than most people seem to use, but I just prefer the thickness of the solder lines. It's just personal preference. My technique for copper foiling is I line the glass up on the foil and try and get it as central as possible. But it's really important to remember that you're only human and this isn't going to be perfect. I see a lot of people a lot of the time getting frustrated that their copper foil isn't lining up straight, but sometimes you also need to remember that the glass that you're working with isn't straight either. A lot of the time there'll be thicker and thinner sections, and some textured glass is just an absolute nightmare to foil anyway. If your foil isn't perfect, it doesn't matter. It shows that this piece is handmade, and I think in a world where everything now is pretty much made by machines, it's nice to see that something's being touched by a human hand. I then use my burnishing tool to fold in all the edges of foil, and once that's laying nice and flat, I properly seal all the edges. And with my X-Acto knife, I trim off any loose edges. I know this seems pedantic, but every piece of copper foil, your solder is going to stick to it. So if you have a squared edge off from where you've not cut the tail off, it will show on your finished soldered piece. And unfortunately, as soon as you place solder on it, it's stuck there. Now you can't get rid of it. So I won't go over every single piece and show you how to foil them all, but I will go over one that's particularly tricky and show you how to foil a piece without getting splits or with minimal splits, because sometimes they are unavoidable. I lay all the foil like normal, but I really make sure to fill the crevice of the curve. Sometimes when you're pulling it tight, you actually pull it out of the curve and then you have a lack of foil in there and it's a mess and you just have to restart the whole thing over again. Then with my burnishing tool, I slowly go over the curve and push it down. And I'm doing this really gently and really slowly. And again, this is another part of stained glass where patience is really important. And then I just burnish the rest like normal. Okay, so now it's time to solder. I use Novacan liquid flux. This is another example of where it's the only brand of flux I've ever used and it's always been perfect for me, so I'm scared to try another one. I've heard some people have issues with gel flux. I think it has pros and cons. It doesn't sizzle as much as liquid flux, but it is harder to clean off because it leaves more of a residue. So I'm just going to stick with what I know best. And I use about half a capful per sun catcher. The one thing about liquid flux is that it evaporates pretty fast. So you have to keep reapplying it, but not applying too much at the same time. I lightly coat all the foil in flux. I just dot all the corners and the seams so I can remove the pins. For some reason I got carried away with myself on this piece and I just started soldering his eye in place, and then I realized what I was doing. The pins get in my way when I'm trying to solder. That's why I join the seams first and then take the pins away. So what I mentioned right at the start of this video, the reason why I prefer the shape of pieces I usually do, which is sort of like a more arched window frame, sort of like a Gothic church window frame shape, because it has more straight angles. And when you're working with straight angles, I can use a ruler really easily to make sure that the piece is level. With a circle, I don't have that luxury. You can get circle sort of wooden frames that you put around a piece. But as you can see with Ivysaur, I like my templates to be quite dynamic, so I've got leaves like sticking out from him. When I'm pinning a template in place, I'll actually have my paper template under the silicone mat, and then I'll line all the pieces up in place, like do a magic trick and slide out the template, hoping that all the glass stays in place, and then pin it all down. But as you can imagine, pieces move slightly and the pins knock them. That's why it's always easier when I can use a ruler on a straight edge, but circles are just a little bit more fiddly, but they look good. If you're thinking, well, why don't you just leave the paper there when you solder? I've tried that before, but I don't know if anyone else has this problem or if I'm doing something weird, but the paper underneath crinkled up because of the heat, and that slid my glass pieces out of place, so that's why I always remove it first. So I have a very particular way of soldering. I like to start on the lines that are going to be in the background and then work my way to the foreground. I think it's probably totally pointless, but does anyone else have any soldering quirks? I have my iron set to 360 and I used to work at a much higher temperature, but I have since found, touch wood, that since turning it down lower, yes, it takes me a little bit longer to work, but I haven't experienced any heat cracks recently. And if you're wondering why I'm using such a tiny soldering tip, it's because I accidentally bought this size on Amazon, but I didn't check the package until it fell out of the return window, and then I did that 3 more times. So now I have a surplus of tips that are too small. It's funny because I think it would drive my old art teacher mad, because he used to complain that when I was painting I would pick the teeniest tiniest brush imaginable to do these large sections, and I'm pretty much doing it again but with stained glass. But I actually kind of like this size now. Like on this smaller section here, I feel like my older larger soldering tip would have smudged all the other solder and made a bit of a mess, whereas this one is just small enough to glide past it. And then once the front is all beautifully soldered, I flip the design and do exactly the same on the back. I usually find the back so much easier to solder because it's the flatter surface of the glass. It takes me way less time to do. And now it's time to add the cane. And I know cane scares some people, but I'm going to show you now how simple it can be, so you can let all those worries go. I'm using 2 types of cane on this design, and it's more of an aesthetic purpose. I tried it out once before and I really liked how it looks, so it's something I tend to do a lot now. I use a larger cane for the border of the circle and then the smaller size cane for the pieces that are like poking out of it, because I want the circle to look like it's an encased frame. And since the cane I'm using is lead, it's pretty flexible, so it's actually quite easy to mold around the edges. And the reason I like cane so much is because I'm actually terrible at beading an edge and I hate doing it. So anytime I can use cane instead, I will. I simply just mold it to the shape of the design and then snip it and add some solder to hold it in place. These pliers that I got for cutting cane with are fantastic and I use them all the time. This is pretty much the only additional tool that I have. Oh, that's a lie. I do stretch my cane first, but I bought the cane stretching vise off Amazon. I think it was like £10. Once that's done, I scrub down all my solder with 4 zeros. Grade Y wool. It needs to be the finest one because if it's not, you might actually scratch your solder. I wash my piece in fairy liquid, and for all of my over the pond friends, that is the equivalent of Dawn dish soap, I think. I've been trying out a new Patina method and I'm excited to share this with you if you haven't seen it before. But I put my black Patina in like a little spray bottle. I was just sort of pouring it in a cap and throwing the cap full over at one point, but it wasn't spreading evenly. So I put it in a spray bottle and now I can get a really even coverage of patina over my piece without wasting patina. And then I just rub it in with my toothbrush. I used to leave my patina on to soak, but now I've completely changed my mind with that and leave it on for about 5 minutes and then take it off. When I was leaving it on to soak for longer, it was leaving like a brown tarnished stain rather than the black that I was looking for. And then I add my, and I can never say this and I'm gonna butcher it, so I'm gonna read it here, carnauba wax. I'm dyslexic, I'm sorry. I waxed it with that and then I leave it to set overnight, and then the following morning when I come back to the piece, you can see the wax is set because it's left a white sheen all over the glass. And finally, for the polish. So I watched a video, and I'm in lots of stained glass groups on Facebook, and it was one where a woman had posted a video of how she'd been polishing her pieces with sawdust. I'd love to credit her, but I don't know who she is. It was just a random video that I was scrolling through that I saw, and she said that the sawdust helps when you're polishing to get in all the nooks and crannies, especially on textured glass. So I gave it a go and fell in love with it, and this is what I've been doing since. Then I take out any final waxy residue with my nail. They're like actually nail Q-tip, I guess. I got those again off Amazon, and then I buff everything off with a cloth because I think that just adds the additional shine to it. And finally, I add a chain. Jack chains are my favourite because I feel like they're the most secure. Hang the piece and we're all done. I really am so impressed with how all the solder lines turned out on this piece. They're so black and juicy looking. The sun really blessed me this day. It was shining so bright and I got such a beautiful shot of the reflection of the glass behind, especially that textured glass on the leaves leaves such a beautiful reflection. And if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I gave you some useful tips that you can apply to your own stained glass project. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for the next Pokemon.